If you could ask God for anything, just one thing, what would it be? To win the lottery, maybe? To make sure your football team won the Super Bowl? David tells us in this psalm what his one thing is that he asked God for, and it's actually a reminder of maybe what our one thing should be. Watch this. All right, good morning. Welcome to our Psalm series. So glad you're joining us. We have been working through Psalms. The goal was to do one Psalm a week. Of course, that stopped when we hit Psalm 23. I think it took 9 lessons to get through Psalm 23. And now we're at Psalm 27, and we're kind of taking it really slow. I think we'll make it in about 4 for this one, because there's so many really great things in Psalm 27 that we've been learning. So I've been excited to teach this because I've been excited to learn for my own personal self too what it has to say. So let's start where we've been. The first week we made it through one whole verse. Yay for me. Spent a lot of time talking about Psalm 27 verse 1. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is my stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? And it's just a reminder that God is very personal to us. And David, who wrote this psalm, really understood that. It's like when he wrote, the Lord is my shepherd in Psalms 23. The Lord is my light. The Lord is my salvation. The Lord is my stronghold. These are amazing words that David used to remind us of what his relationship with God was. I love that David felt this way personally about God. He knew that he was intricately involved in his life. He knew that he didn't have to ever be fearful of anything. He didn't have to be fearful that bad things were going to happen. He trusted that God would take care of him, even if something bad happened. But for his trials that he went through, David's were a little bit different than ours. Ours are like, oh, I'm so afraid I'm going to lose my job, or oh, I'm so afraid I'm going to flunk out of school, or I'm so afraid I'll get sick, or that I'll get old, or whatever. David had bigger trials in his life. His were like, oh my gosh, an army's coming against me and they're trying to kill me. Oh my gosh, my son hates me and he's trying to take my throne. Oh my gosh, the king is out once again to try to find me. Like, this was his life. So this psalm could have been written for any of those situations, which is why I love Psalms, because it's just a reminder that sometimes when we think that our problems are so bad, like nobody could be going through what we're going through, it's a reminder that there are some people like King David who had a lot worse things going on in their life. And we can look around at people and we can think ours is the worst, but really if you can grasp it around the world, you probably live a pretty good life compared to a lot of other people. But the good thing about David is that he just knew God was there. So David goes on to explain why he could be afraid. He says in verse 2, he said, when evil men advance against me, okay, they want to devour my flesh, that's cause for fear. He said, when my enemies and my foes attack me, they will stumble and fall. Though an army besiege me, my heart will not fear. Though war break out against me, even then will I be confident. He trusts that God is going to take care of that. And at this particular time, David doesn't seem too fearful. So let's move on today with verse 4. We see David say something that I'm hoping today will make us stop and ask ourselves this question. For those of you that remember the detective on TV, his name was Columbo. Okay, this was a long time ago. But it was a detective show, and Columbo was kind of funny. He always looked kind of homeless. He always annoyed people with his questions. And just when you think he's done interrogating someone, he turns around to walk away, and then he turns back and says, wait. I just have one more thing. Just one more thing. And so today I want to ask you, if you could ask God for just one thing, what would it be? Like to win the lottery? To get a new house? For you to heal? For God to heal us? Maybe the one thing for you is want my child to get into that college, or maybe for you, you're trying to get pregnant. So that one thing is, I just want to get pregnant. Usually one thing is something that we want from God, like a prayer request, a need, a want. But for David, he doesn't ask God for things like that, at least in this particular psalm. He asks God for something amazing, his one thing. Look at verse 4. One thing I ask of the Lord, that is what I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to seek him in his temple. The one thing that David wanted from God was God himself. He wanted to know that God was present in his life daily. He wanted to gaze on who God really was, the magnificence of God. Because if David had that, whether he lived or whether he died, none of that mattered. His one thing, one purpose, was to live his life focused on God. See, for David, his greatest desire was, no matter what he was going through, making sure that the presence of the Lord would always be in his life. Now, for David, he said the house of the Lord. It says the temple. But at this time that David wrote this, the temple wasn't built yet. David wanted to build this magnificent temple for God, but because everyone was worshiping in a tent. It was the tabernacle. It was actually the same tent that Moses used in the wilderness when he wandered for 40 years. And now, hundreds of years later, it's back in Jerusalem. And this is where God said, this is where his presence was. His presence dwelled in this tabernacle, this tent. David always wanted to build something magnificent for God, a temple, a real temple. So what this verse basically seems to be saying is this: the one thing I want in my life is to know you are present with me all the time. Because if someone dwelled in the temple, or eventually dwelled in the tabernacle, eventually in the temple, it just meant they were nearest to the presence of God. And here we see David, who's in danger, for his life, but it doesn't really matter, because he knows that the presence of God is with him regardless. So I want you to think about that. How would you do in life if you knew for 100% fact that the presence of God was with you 24/7? He's always there. Nothing in your life is a shock to him. Something bad happens. Someone calls in the middle of the night. Somebody, shows up at your door with bad news, whatever it is. What if you knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that it wasn't just random, that God really was present? Even in the midst of tragic news or bad news or heartbreaking news, would that change how you react to your life? Because I think if we really, really believe that, then we would feel comfort and peace no matter what was happening around us. And it seems this is what David is saying, because he, of all people, knew his life was filled most of the time with turmoil. And somehow he just knew this peace of God that he had in the midst of it. And that was his prayer. One thing, that's it. One thing, just one thing, God, that I will dwell in your presence forever. So, what would that mean for us as followers of Jesus, like thousands of years later? Well, Jesus talks a few times in the Bible about this one thing. We see it here with the story of the rich young ruler. Here's a guy who comes to Jesus. He's Jewish, he's moral, he's rich, he's earnest, he's sincere, he's just an overall good guy. And he wants to know from Jesus, what do I need to do to get to heaven? That's a question a lot of people want to know. Because in his mind, he's like, I'm keeping the law. I'm keeping the 10 Commandments, plus a whole bunch more. He goes, I'm a good guy. Good guys should go to heaven. So he comes to Jesus in Luke 18:18. A certain ruler asked him, good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Now, it was interesting that this guy called Jesus good, because normally he would have addressed him as master or teacher, because Jesus was a rabbi. But the word good was used for God alone. So in a sense, it was almost like this guy was testing the water, like, I kind of heard you were God, but just not really sure if that's who you are. So Jesus responds in verse 19, why do you call me good? Jesus answered, no one is good except God alone. So if Jesus is God, okay, he surely would have the answers for this guy. Because remember, this guy is a devout Jewish guy. He read the Torah. He knew what the Torah at the time had to say. He knew the law. He knew there was over 600 of them. He knew the 10 Commandments. He kept every one. Like, this is a guy, in his eyes, he should go to heaven. So Jesus plays into that. Verse 20. He goes, you know the commandments. Do not commit adultery. Do not murder. Do not steal. Do not give false testimony. Honor your father and mother. And in verse 21, he says, all of these I have kept since I was a boy, he said. Now, he probably expects Jesus to say, perfect, you're in. Good job for you. But Jesus doesn't. He says something really shocking. Verse 22 says, and when Jesus heard this, he said to him, you still lack one thing. One thing. Sell everything and give to the poor, and you will have a treasure in heaven. Then come follow me. The guy is like, what? Are you joking? Sell everything? Like, I have a ton of money. I'm so wealthy. Now, just as a side note, Jesus doesn't care if someone is wealthy. As long as the wealth or the money or the house or the second house or whatever is not your one thing. Our one thing has to be about following Jesus. David's one thing was God himself. His relationship with God was first and foremost in his life. The rich young ruler, his one thing was his money. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, what is our one thing? And you may say, well, I'm not wealthy, so that can't be my one thing. Okay, well, maybe your one thing is different. Like Martha, okay? Mary and Martha, they're sisters. Martha was busy. She's a doer. She's a type A personality. I got to get this done. Martha was busy, so they have Jesus over to the house. And Martha's getting everything all ready, and she's cooking and she's serving. But unfortunately, that was her one thing. Luke 10:38, as Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he had to say. So you can just imagine, Martha's running around getting all the food cooked and everything, the table set and everything's perfect. And granted, someone has to do the cooking, okay? But Mary, on the other hand, the other sister, she's not helping. She's one thing intent on, and that is the words of Jesus. She just wants to know what Jesus has to say. Because Jesus is in the house, okay? So she's sitting at his feet, listening intently. One thing. And that was Jesus. That was his words. That was what she could learn from him. But Martha doesn't like that. Look at verse 40. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, Lord, don't you care that my sisters left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me. And you'd think Jesus would reply like, come on, Mary, stop being lazy, get up. Nope, Jesus doesn't say that. He says in verse 41, Martha, Martha, the Lord answered, you are worried and upset about many things, but only one thing is needed. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will be not taken away from her. One thing, Jesus, living for what Jesus says, whatever he says, we do. Matthew 6:33, Jesus tells us what that one thing should be. But seek first, one, his kingdom and his righteousness. And all these other things will be given to you. You know, God's going to take care of you, and he's going to make sure that you're, have what you need. But he's saying the first thing, the one thing you need to do is seek first his kingdom. Not our own personal kingdom, but his kingdom. We see it again when Jesus heals a blind man. He heals the blind man on a Sabbath, which apparently is a no-no if you're Jewish back then and religious. So the religious Pharisees are trying to trap Jesus. John 9:10 says this, Jesus heals the blind men, and then the Pharisees, were questioning the blind men. He says, how then were your eyes open, they demanded. And he replied, well, the man they called Jesus made some mud, put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed and then I could see. I said, where's this man? He said, I don't know. And then you see in verse 24, they're so frustrated. So the religious guys bring the blind man back in, the healed blind man back in. It says, a second time they summoned the man who had been blind. Give glory to God. They're going to start out and act really religious. They said, we know this man is a sinner, talking about Jesus. But the blind man knows one thing. He replied, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing that I do know. I was blind and now I see. See, the cool part about that is whether we were blind, spiritually blind, the one thing we should know is that because of what Jesus did, what he did on the cross, what he did to save us so that we could spend eternity with him, the one thing we should know is that we're different. We have to be different. That's the one thing. When Jesus comes in our life, we will change. But we live in a world today, especially in the churches, where Jesus is really not our one thing. It's amazing, but during 2020 and COVID, when everything was being shut down, we actually got a taste of what our one thing really is. We could see how we responded when our one thing, like our TV shows, the concerts, our football games, our basketball games, when those were shut down, our work. And what happened with COVID is it gave us some time to pause and think, what actually is my one thing? What is the most important thing in my, is it Jesus? Is it my relationship with him? Is it getting the good news of him out into the world? What is my one thing? Dr. Larry Pettin said this, in just a short time, just like he did with the plagues of ancient Egypt, God had taken away everything that we worship as an idol in place of him. It's as if God were screaming for the world to hear. You want to worship athletes? I'm going to shut down the stadiums. You want to worship musicians? I'm going to shut down the civic centers. You want to worship Hollywood? I'm going to shut down the theaters. You want to worship money? I'm going to shut down the economy and collapse the stock market. You don't want to go to church? Well, I'm going to make it where you can't go to church, but you long to go to church. He goes on to say this, maybe we need to take this time of isolation from the distractions of the world and have a personal revival where we remember that our one thing that really matters in this world is our relationship to God. And that's what we see with David. Verse 4, one thing. David says, I ask of the Lord, this is what I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to seek him in his temple. If you are watching today and you're like, I don't feel that way. I really don't. I don't think God is my one thing. I don't think Jesus is my one thing. Then today I want you to stop and I want you to ask God. Go someplace, get on your knees, pray, whatever you need to do, and ask God, God, what is it that's my one thing? And then turn away from that. Ask God to give you a desire to have him be your one thing. Because that actually, as a follower of Jesus, that should be our greatest desire. To know him better, to follow him more deeply, and to share him with others more desperately. I hope that helps today. Let's look within ourselves, ask for what our one thing is, and let's make a change today on that. Hope you have a really good day.